Thank you so much. And hi, I'm just going to go grab the presentation real fast here. There it is. And we can go anytime. You ready, Jacob?
I am. Good afternoon, everyone.
All right. Got the countdown clock going so that I know that I don't run over. Welcome from Austin, Texas. And Jacob is in space somewhere. And we're going to tell you a little bit today about software engineering with Innersource. Somebody in the last talk, which I watched, Vicky Brisser just gave a talk about emerging markets and how people get it wrong when they don't treat open source as an emerging market when they're trying to come into it. And one of the questions was, well, there were two. Have you seen epic fails was one of them. And the other one was, what's the number one thing that causes people to fail? And Vicky's answer was not having situational awareness about one's use of open source. And I think that's a really good piece of advice. But I wrote a little private note that basically said Innersource was designed to deal with this. As Vicky did, I experienced a ton of unintentional failure from companies that were trying to understand how to do open source. And to me, it looked like a set of answers that were just waiting for them to see, but they weren't paying attention. They were diving into it as though it was a virgin pond instead of a sort of well-traveled waterway. And and good news for consultants, we have a lot of business that way, but not so good for the people actually trying to get a good outcome. So anyway, we started talking about Interstores, and you'll hear more about it, but it is first and foremost, at least from my perspective, intended to help companies figure out how to do this better. So here we go. First of all, what is open source? This is Open Source 101. You guys have probably heard something about what open source is a few times now. For our purposes of this talk, we're mostly talking about the method of open source. And that is the way that we work together. This piece of artwork, totally strangely, came from Microsoft. So Jacob, what do you think about that? It's pretty interesting, isn't it?
I think it's fabulous. We're here today at Open Source 101. This is a great event, teaching everyone introduction to open source and now Intersource. We've come a long ways in the history of open source to be able to have Microsoft, praising, and we're seeing this kind of artwork coming from them. They've really turned a page, and they're actually a great partner to work with when it comes to open source these days.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. So this is the reason that we picked this piece of artwork is because it focuses on the how a little bit. It has to be open, it has to be collaborative, and you have to show some flex. You can't just throw it over the wall and hope it sticks. You actually have to pay attention.
The other thing, so the other thing that we're just giving a little bit of a primer here on open source to kind of guide you into the relationship between open source and Intersource. So as you probably know, being here at Open Source 101, open source requires an OSI approved license to be called open source. So there's a body called the Open Source Initiative that everyone is able to join and participate in. And
I think Josh gave a keynote about this, or was it on a panel?
That he did, yes, he did. And so the first thing of open source is, of course, we have to choose an OSI approved license. Next thing about open source, it's about collaborating and the methods and the flexibility of collaboration in the public. So you're here today, you've heard about open source, you're doing open source, you're probably using GitHub, etc. This is all public collaboration as compared to what we're going to talk to in a minute about when you can't do it in public. We're going to talk about Intersource. Next slide. Then the other thing that about open source today is it's all about community. It's about the idea of community members coming together. Humans have been coming together as community for a long time. Now it's developers coming together to form communities. And that community aspect of software development is very powerful. And here we see a picture of even how open source today is being used here in Baltimore. to provide engagement between the university, various city government agencies, and a community association here. And that would not have been possible without the ability for open source and the work to happen in the open.
Oops, for some reason I'm not able to advance the slides. Give me a second here. It's because I went and looked at the chat. I was wrong to do that, apparently. I'll get rid of it. No, I can't get rid of it. Why? That's annoying. There we go. All right. So now let's talk about what Innersource is and how it's different from open source. First of all, it uses many of the same open collaboration frameworks. And this is another example of collaboration, but it's inside an arena. It's just for the people that are there. And it's in Barcelona. So it's one of the fun things that they do during Carnival in Barcelona. It's a much more efficient and modern way of engineering, however. This is an example of efficient modern building engineering. This was all made out of components. And one of the things that open source is really designed for is modularity of designs so that people can make discrete changes without upsetting the whole apple cart. And so, so that's why I chose this picture, but it's more efficient and modern, both in the open and in Intersource. But the difference is in Intersource, a lot of times the people that are practicing for the first time are using really old fashioned ways of working. And so it feels really different to them. And then it also supports an open community. It's just internal to the organization. Like these ladies from the UT crew, they're on their boat and they're not dealing too much with anybody, you know, that isn't on the boat. They're all pulling in the same direction, but they're not influenced too much by the outside. So now let's go into a little bit more about the kinds of things that Intersource does for people. Well, first of all, what does software engineering require? Good software engineering requires both discipline and scale in modern terms. There was a time when you could write a small little thing and it didn't matter if it scaled because it was just to solve a specific problem. But these days, everything's happening at such a huge scale. And this is one of the things that older engineering cultures get stuck in. They don't know how to scale because they've written monolithically. They've written for a certain kind of market, and then they become very successful. All of a sudden, they can't keep up, or one of their competitors suddenly can do a bunch of stuff they can't do. But because they haven't taken the time to think about how they're going to scale, you know, they're tied to older ways of checking to make sure the software isn't going to, new features aren't going to, you know, upset the apple cart. They're not able to be nimble enough, and then they can't compete. So this is one of the main reasons that people get interested in open source, because open source is eating their lunch. But if they try to dive into open source, in my experience, without first learning how to do it within their shop properly, they're really probably going to fail. And it might be quite expensive, and it might cost some goodwill and definitely also some brand value. So you want to talk about the next one?
Well, I was going to just kind of give it a little bit of framing on the last one. It seems like that the open source methods have been successfully used in the open to get scale and discipline. These are the methods we've used. And now we're with Intersource, we're taking those same methods and we're bringing them inside the corporate firewall to get that same kind of efficiency and scale and benefits when the code can't be public.
Okay, this slide is about craft and quality. That's another demand of good software engineering, modern software engineering. Honestly, craft has fallen out of a lot of software development at this point, as companies decide that time is the great leveler rather than quality. Engineers are pushed with unrealistic workloads, and in an environment that doesn't make their lives easier. They're expected to wait around for other people, but they have deadlines that they can't control. they've got more work to do than they could get done anyway. And then the ways that quality are implemented are really painful. And they don't have time to be craftsmen most of the time. And that's really sad, because at the end of the day, they're artists. People who get good at making software have a specific bent. This is their craft. And so they get very dissatisfied at work. And then, of course, if they're penalized for defects, that makes them even more dissatisfied because they don't have good ways to get around those issues. So how is it different in Intersource? That was for you.
Oh, sorry. Why don't you go ahead and take this one? I'll take the documentation one.
Okay. So the deal is that it's built into the open source method that there is review. So nobody is ever expected to just get it right on their own. In my experience, a lot of old school engineering organizations try to do this. They'll institute code review, but because time is the prime directive, people start rubber stamping each other's code. They don't really have time to do serious code review, and they may or may not also have the skills. So open source changes, or Intersource changes that whole equation, both inside a company and also out in the public. And that's why things move so much more quickly and at a higher level of quality. As Vicky said before, there are just more eyes on the problem, but also there's a less linear, more parallel process to make sure that all these things are actually considered. And the way that the whole thing is set up, the person who's the gatekeeper for quality really has to do their job, and they want to because their name is on that merge request, right? All right, and then the last one we have in this section is Margaret Hamilton, who wrote all of this code. This is code printed out on gray bar, and this was printed out to support the first successful manned moon mission. And you know, this is documentation, because code is also documentation. So let's talk about this.
Well, inside the corporate environment, if you want other people and other developers to be working on your code, if we want to move to an Intersource way of working, we have to document the code, and we have to provide on-ramps, just like with open source code, to build a community, to have others contribute. Same thing with Intersource. We have to document our code, and Intersource almost acts as a forcing function if we want to have other developers within the corporate environment working on an Intersource project.
And the whole reason that we need to do all of this is, as we know, Mark Andreessen noticed that software is everywhere now. Companies that never wrote software before have to have at least a website and maybe an app and maybe some other stuff just to get their work done. And somebody else came along in this presentation and said, yeah, but open source is eating software. And that's also true. There isn't a company that you can name, a name brand, Fortune 100 company you can name that has come up in the last 20 years that would be here if there was no open source, because it is the engine that has been driving the huge acceleration of technology, which you might hate or you might love, but it's here for us. And so we have to deal with it, right? Now, this is a picture of a house that got moved in San Francisco recently. They used to do a lot more of this, and now they only do it if the house is really valuable. So imagine that house is your old company that you work for that has old ways of doing things. And I keep saying old, but honestly, it could be a new company that just isn't very clueful about how to collaborate internally. Sometimes companies choose specialization or ownership as a main piece of the culture, thinking that that's going to make people have more pride in their work. And initially that works, but over time it can become warring fiefdoms, right? So these people thought that this house was worth moving, even though it was probably quite expensive. They had to close a bunch of roads in San Francisco. And people who approach Intersource or open source as a way to fix their engineering woes need to realize that this needs to be a deliberate process. It needs to go slowly and thoughtfully. It's going to take longer than you think it's going to take. But there are a lot of companies that have proven to themselves that this was worth doing. And this sort of started in fintech, the modern adoption of this, but there are many other walks of life. We'll show you a slide in a minute that shows you all the companies that are talking about their Intersource successes right now. And so basically, Intersource improves software engineering by getting them into a more modern way of working. And it also teaches all those people that learn those skills how to also contribute properly in the open source world. It simultaneously does that. So, so it's pretty valuable that way. Do you have anything else to say about this slide? Great.
No, I'm looking forward to getting into the actual example and like seeing like how does this work inside a corporation, because we've been talking the theory.
So this next set of slides is designed to help you know that. And these are actual slides that I wrote in 2015 to try to convince PayPal to go this way. So full disclosure, I've been an Apache member since 2005, but I was also around when they incorporated. And I've been a fan of the Apache way for a long time. Apache is the largest single repository of code in the world that is licensed under a single license, and also all using the Apache way, which is a set of ways to do things, methods, that is basically the core of what Intersource is. So here we go. Here's an example so you can understand it quickly. Let's say, for the sake of argument, you are in a company that has silos, has big chunks of code that belong to a small number of people. And let's say that somebody outside your silo needs to make a change to your code in order to do their work. Let's say that they're from one of the regions and there's something that is companies or country specific. And there's probably also a timeline associated with getting this change made because they need to get the feature out. So they send a feature request. In most companies, this is how it works now. Send a feature request because the experts are over in the core. They should write this feature. But they don't actually know that it's coming. So it's not been in their planning. And so they're going to sit on it for a while. This is very normal, right? So they've got their own planned work. Eventually, the guy from Brazil gets a phone call from his boss. And we always draw the bosses as Swiss cheeses for some reason. So he gets a call from his cheese, and the cheese says, "Why haven't you finished your work?" And he says, "I sent a feature request, I'm waiting." And so, you know, the cheese needs it to get done. So he calls his peer, the other cheese, and they have a conversation. Sometimes those conversations are quite heated. Eventually, the cheese over on the core side will get one of his people to do the feature request, and yay, right? It finally happens. But the question is, what was learned in that process? In a lot of companies, executives throwing their weight around is the way that most work is scheduled. And even if there's a plan of work, the first people that used open source at PayPal, they already knew exactly how much time that was taking. It was 65% of their potential work time was caught up in dealing with cheeses that were yelling at each other and changing the order of what work was going to get done. And they were sick of it. And this was their original reason for wanting to do Innersource. So nobody learns anything, I would say, in this particular process. But what if we thought about the way that open source works? This is an important slide because it helps you understand why I recommend that 10% of your engineering resources should be put into trusted committership. So the trusted committer is a special engineer. Now, interestingly enough, they only have that hat on for a limited amount of time because most engineers were hired to write code and also get all of their recognition and you know, raises and everything based on their ability to write code. They tend to get pushed in the direction of management because it's hard to get ahead as an individual contributor. But in the open source world, and the Apache projects have been studied by lots of academics, there's been noticed a pretty standard progression of factors of 10. So for 1,000 users of a given piece of code, there will be, in an Apache project, 100 committers who are trying to contribute to that code base. And of those 100, 10 of them will have the facility with the code to act as trusted committers. And they'll actually get a promotion in the open source project to be called trusted committers. And most of their job, they might still write code, but most of their job is reviewing contributor patches and deciding if they can be merged or not, and mentoring those contributors to get those patches better before they're merged, because it's their job their name goes on that merge. And if the merge, breaks everything, then they're the one that everybody's going to look at. Open source uses public notice, public reputation building, but it works both ways. If you do something stupid, everybody knows it was you, right? And then at the top, there might be one or two leads in a typical Apache project. There aren't any bosses, but these people have shown, real technical leadership, and questions get escalated to them, sometimes by the trusted committers. All right, so understanding that progression, what if instead of the core being a blank box to the person submitting the feature request, what if they could see their code and read it and make a decision about a patch that they might submit to get the work done instead of waiting for somebody to do it? That would definitely feel better to the Brazilian engineer, because they could actually progress their work. They wouldn't have to wait around until the cheeses get mad, right? So engineers like to scratch their own itch. But this only works if there's somebody to catch the code on the core side, and that person's job, he's called a trusted committer. And we always say, put 10% of your code, of your resources into this. And the first time I said that to somebody, the engineer or the manager said to me, can I put all of the work that is trying to change in this code base through that process? In other words, can I put my own core engineer's work through the trusted committer so he can get used to how to do that? Because he's not going to have a lot of contributed code right away from outside our group. And I said, of course you can. And he was very happy to hear that. And when I said, why are you so happy about this? He said, here's the thing. We hire engineers, we give them commit access because they're supposed to be engineers. It's not always a good idea. Sometimes people need to take longer to understand how the whole thing works. And most of our defects are caused by people who don't know quite what they're doing, and then their code isn't reviewed sufficiently. So this will automatically make my code better quality. I know it will. And now I have a non-shaming reason to do it because this person needs to practice. I'm like, great, that's excellent. He knows exactly how much of a code increase he got because PayPal's really into counting those numbers. He got 25% the first week that this happened. So he was already super happy guy, right? So there's a reward, right? So now we're going to talk about the rewards of working this way. So once the Brazilian guy has been through the mentorship, has gone through a few iterations, and now his code is good enough to be merged, he feels great because he got his work done, but also he learned something about somebody else's code base, and he, learning is always good, right? But, what about the guy that is doing the code mentorship? What is his big reward for working in this way, right? It's a good question. And there are a few rewards that we got on that side. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction, sorry. So what about the TC? Well, first of all, most big old companies are trying to figure out how to turn their code from monolithic, meaning it's all in one big clump, to modular, like those apartment buildings, so that everything is kind of the same size roughly, and people can make changes to one little piece without blowing the whole building, right? It's a much more modern approach. And a lot of shops ask their engineers to do this work, and they can read up about microservices and about modularity, but they don't necessarily know where to draw those lines until they've had to explain it to somebody else. And what we found was 1,000% of the time, they understand how to modularize after they've had to explain it to a foreign contributor. And so, refactoring clues was the second big wonderful thing that happened. The third big wonderful thing was that conversation that they had with the Brazilian guy. If they capture that conversation and extract it from GitHub, because we were using GitHub, and put it into a durable archive that is, indexed, then the next time somebody asks them, how do I do this thing that, how do I do what Brazil just did? What if one of the other regions wants to do that? Well, now there's an archive that explains everything about how to do that. And so that will save time for the trusted committer and also for the next engineer, because he doesn't have to ask a bunch of questions and wait for answers. He can just read what happened before. And his first submission will be closer to mergeable, maybe mergeable right away. So that's another big takeaway. You can ask an engineer to write documentation, make a documentation sprint, but it will be the best case scenario. They'll talk about the code lovingly, like it's their child. But if they have to actually explain it to somebody else, then you start finding out that certain methods are known to not be so useful and others would be a better way to go. And there's a reason for that. Maybe it's not a nice reason. You get the real story. All right. So, and then the last thing is, once one of these people gets really good from the outside of your organization at doing something, you can recommend to new people trying to get the same effect that they could be talking to the person who has learned how to successfully get a pull request merged into the core. So that is a further piece of respect for the Brazilian engineer, but it also creates awareness inside the core that there are engineers outside their group that are equally good engineers. Because a lot of engineers, part of the problem with the ownership culture is people think that their own club is the best club. And see if this sounds familiar to you. Transactional engineers never think that UI engineers know what they're doing. UI engineers never think that transactional engineers understand what they do. Turns out there are good engineers at all strata of the community. It's just a question of whether they've been given the opportunity. And this is a way to grow the engineers in your company at the pace that they take, the choices that they make to learn about other people's code. Once you do Innersource, your best engineers can become known much more quickly. And that's really valuable for the organization. We talked a lot about intrinsic rewards. Extrinsic rewards, like, can we give them money? Can we do bug bounties? Those kinds of things. You have to use those very judiciously, is my advice. And there's a quick primer on Intersource. And now we can get back to talking about how to do it in your organization.
Thanks, Denise. That was awesome to see it from your perspective inside, because you have so much experience. Question on that: what percentage of when done right does it clean up the cheese's time?
Well, I actually ban the cheeses from doing any kind of escalation like that. And initially, it's really hard for them because one of the really common bad patterns is I'm important and I can get things done, right? It's just a human trait. But they do appreciate getting the time back, and certainly the engineers appreciate getting the time back. So as I said, that those people that had 65% interrupt-driven work ended up getting down under 5% interruption, and that was wonderful for them.
Yeah, this is really important and really powerful returns. So that leads us to the question of what can Intersource do? Why do people do this? As we were saying, this really does go to help breaking down the silos inside a corporation to really get the maximum benefit of your workforce. It also really empowers the engineers themselves. Better culture for your engineering works.
Yeah, fewer bottlenecks, which is what that road slide is about.
Quality seems like it's increasing because of multiple reasons, but including the culture and engineers having the ability to do that. It's breaking old habits and really getting people into the more modern way of doing, like open source development, so they can do it internally as well as externally. And really a lot on teamwork, I'd imagine, the ability to work in teams, to engage in teams, and not always have to go up and have the communication be up through the cheeses, but it's a lot more team focused and cross collaboration between teams directly. This is a lot of the benefits that corporations are seeing from Intersource. And Denise, I'm sure you've seen a lot more in your years of engagements.
Yeah, well, there's also, Vicky talked about the cost of losing your newest employees. The fact is that the emerging workforce, the newest kids, the ones that you can have for the cheapest money, and then you grow inside your organization, they expect agency because they're digital natives. They're not the same people that I was when I became, a new entrant into this industry. I was just all glossy-eyed and willing to take on whatever, and I worked at Apple first, which is one of the most siloed companies in the world. But I was really frustrated by the time 6 years in, I was like, there's got to be a better way to do this. You know, these kids are not going to wait around 6 years. They'll just go find somewhere cooler to work. And that's why older companies really need to get into this now, because they need to learn it so they can keep their newest employees happy. And truthfully, it increases your net promoter score as an employer across all strata automatically.
There's a lot of people doing Innersource.
Yeah, these are just the companies that are publicly talking about it. And as we know from Innersource Commons, there's lots of other companies that are not talking about it publicly yet because they're not done learning it. So yeah, it's kind of shocking. Look at how many different kinds of companies do. It's really interesting that way. I will say, I want to call out Comcast, who's in this picture here, Comcast, NBC Universal. They do an interesting thing, which I'm hearing more and more people pick up now. Before you do an open source project out of Comcast, you have to build an internal Innersource community around it to prove that you can collaborate with somebody that isn't in your own team, which I think is a really good hack. So, all right. Now, what makes companies actually successful at doing this? Boy, it's a complicated amalgam of things. So first of all, they have to be able to look at themselves. They have to be able to have an honest look at why this isn't already happening. And they have to be willing to take the steps that it's going to take to actually make it happen, at least in a seed experiment that lets them see if there's any potential for it. And there are companies where this is never going to work. But, you know, I'm optimistic that almost any company can get something out of this. So first thing is willingness to really honestly look at your culture. The next one is to be willing to prove it to yourself. Do the seed experiment. And if, for instance, as I found at PayPal, a big part of the problem was executives stand between them and the engineers. You have to make it you have to set it up so that that first project is most likely to work, right? In order to do that, you're probably going to need air cover, meaning people that are more important than you that think this is a good idea, and also ground cover, meaning other engineers that are tired of the old way of working and really want to see a change. I have seen successful companies work from ground all the way up, but that requires a single person who is really tired of working the wrong way and uniquely qualified to be a change agent. And those folks don't grow on trees, but they do exist because we see companies try it all the time. We very rarely see that succeed, but when it does, it really succeeds. And then they have to have a realistic idea of how long it's going to take. There was, in the last decade, there was a real tendency to want to try Agile as the big digital transformation that everybody was going to do. And I watched a company spend millions of dollars on an Agile transformation that after 4 years and millions of dollars, still only had 16% penetration in the engineering community. So change is hard. In that same exact time period, at the same company, we spent way less than $1 million, and we got 25% right away. And that's partially because Innersource appeals to the very ills that are most annoying to companies, to individuals, engineers. They just need agency to pull it off. And another piece of the puzzle is looking at your guardians. Your culture guardians are usually your middle managers. And they're in an enviable position. Usually they see themselves as directly keeping everybody employed. And they're not wrong about that. But they tend to love the status quo because it is a known thing, and the unknown brings risks and people might get hurt. And so they're going to need some help to be relieved of the notion that they need to stand between progress and the desire of the engineers or even senior management to get things done. So successful companies figure out how to finesse that issue. And then lastly, they figure out how to scale it. There's a way to communicate in the company why this is a good idea. And those communications are made so that scaling it out, they don't have to keep going through belief that it's not going to work. belief that it's not going to do anything. So after doing a seed experiment and seeing how well it works, you got to turn those people into ambassadors. You have to keep rinsing and repeating the value you create into the consciousness of the whole company. Those are some heavy things to figure out how to do, but lucky for you, there's lots of ways to learn about that.
If we were going to
go ahead.
If we were going to just start with a few things to start out with, I think this is the slide where we're going to give them some pointers in terms of what are those concrete steps just to get going.
Right, so find 2 teams that already want to collaborate for all the reasons. So they're both motivated to get it done. Set up a project where they, for some limited amount of time, are going to be encouraged to do this. They'll get whatever else they're measured on, how much code they push out or whatever else it is, goes away. And this is the only thing that's important. Can they figure out how to collaborate in this way? And then measure what they're doing. Don't go crazy with the measurements, but convince yourself that there's progress. You can do it by lines of code coming in that way. You can do it by quality. I've given you lots of the benefits of Innersource that you can measure on, but then notice the ones that you're not measuring, because there's probably others. And then at a defined endpoint, so decide ahead of time, we're going to do this for a quarter, we're going to do this for 10 sprints, or whatever your measure is going to be, right? At the end of it, evaluate what worked, what didn't, what would you do differently if you could start over, and then go looking for another one. Do 2 or 3 of these. Take a good 6 months to a year to validate, because once you commit to doing it in the whole company, it's going to be a lot of work. It won't necessarily be a lot of expense, but it's going to be a lot of work. Meanwhile, look at what tooling you need that you don't have. You can't even begin to do this if you can't make the code visible between the 2 teams, right? But look at the other bits of the puzzle as well as you're going along. Is that enough?
Perfect.
Grand. All right, this is Innersource Commons. We just rebooted this website, and this is the new front page of it. This is a free place, free as in no cost, that you can go, get a Slack account, hang out with people that are on this same journey, and it's a fabulous community. There are a lot of resources there. There are tutorials that were recorded with O'Reilly. There's a workbook to see if you understood what you learned in the tutorials. There are over 100 videos of presentations that have been done at our conferences that answer a wide range of questions. There are books, 6 books that different people have written. I wrote a couple of them, and there are a bunch of others that give you case studies, give you practical advice at a deeper level than we're able to do here. There are patterns books. If you run into a problem, you can see if it's already been documented as a pattern and what mitigations there might be. It's a fabulous community, and it runs under Chatham House rules, which means that you won't be shamed for asking questions there. It's been very successful. If you happen to work in fintech, there's also a special interest group being run through an organization called FINOS, which is the financial services open source nonprofit that the Linux Foundation runs. And the difference there is that all the topics are fintech topics. It's not as broad. But if that's your bag, then you might want to look at that. And the last thing I have to say is, and this is a picture from one of our recent virtual events, Innersource is people just like open source. And the people that have come to Innersource Commons are just the best. I'm not sure how we got such a great crew. Jacob, you're one of them. What do you think?
It's a fabulous community. When we get together in person, everyone's very welcoming and etc. And it's probably one of the best communities I've had the privilege of being involved in over the last couple of years.
Yeah, we really value niceness and sharing and trying to help people. So give us a try, see what you think. And that is the end of this talk. If there are questions, which I'm not seeing any in chat, but I can't tell if I haven't been seeing updates, then now's the time if you haven't done it yet. No? Okay, so I'm going to ask you, Jacob, what's the first thing that somebody should do when they join Innersource Commons?
The first thing that they should do when they join Innersource Commons is introduce themselves and join our Slack. That's
Cool.
that's the number one. That's the number one thing is to get involved. The next thing, it's the pandemic season, but I do encourage you to come to our events. It's a good way to get accustomed to the culture, and then also reach out to us directly. Where a number of us are very happy to have one-on-ones at any time to help new entrants into the community.
We also have a service to come and speak at your company if that's something that you need. And I spend a lot of my time doing exactly that. So, all right, well, we are done, I believe. I think that's the end of our time based on my clock.